Snow drifted across the empty station platform, as if winter itself had decided to gather there, whispering over the boards and catching in the spaces beneath Evelyn Hart's shoes. She stepped down from the train with careful, trembling movements, the weight of her small suitcase cutting into her gloved fingers, though the cold numbed most of the pain. Her breath rose in little silver clouds, fragile things that vanished too quickly. She told herself she would not shiver, not when she needed every scrap of dignity she could hold. But the wind didn't care for dignity. It curled around her shoulders, lifted her hair, and seeped deep into her bones like an old memory that refused to let go. She scanned the station yard, searching for the man who had written to her, the man who promised a home, a hearth, and a life steadier than the one she left behind. Caleb Dunn. Rancher. Stable income. Brief, unsentimental letters that nevertheless suggested he wanted a wife more than an ornament. She had believed that was enough, or at least enough to risk everything she had left. But as she waited, the lantern light flickering across the drifted snow, she felt hope thinning into a thread she could barely see. Footsteps clattered inside the station house. Mrs. Alder leaned out, cheeks flushed from stove heat. Her shawl smelled faintly of pine. "Your fellow said he'd be here by sundown, dear," she murmured, trying to sound reassuring, though her eyes kept darting to the storm clouds gathering like heavy thoughts overhead. Evelyn nodded, pulling her coat tighter, hiding the tremble in her hands. Minutes passed like long, cold hours. A distant jingle of harness bells, then the uneven trot of a horse dragging a sleigh. Caleb arrived with the sharp scent of whiskey drifting ahead of him. He jumped down, boots hitting the snow with a careless thud. His eyes swept over her once, quickly, as if assessing a piece of lumber he'd ordered and found not quite straight. She lifted her chin, waiting. He frowned, rubbing frost from his beard. "You're Evelyn?" The question sounded more like disappointment than uncertainty. She managed a small nod. The lanterns swayed as wind pressed against them, light stuttering across his face. Caleb shifted, cleared his throat, then muttered something she couldn't hear. He looked toward his horse as though searching for an escape route. I pictured someone different. Softer. Less worn by travel." His voice cracked with irritation. "And you came late in the season. Snow's too deep already. I ain't prepared for all this." His words were not cruel, but they cut all the same, slicing through the thin barrier of hope she'd wrapped herself in. Evelyn felt her breath catch, felt her heart stumble like a horse in icy water. She tried to answer, but Caleb raised a hand, already stepping back. "I changed my mind. Should have written sooner. Sorry for the trouble." Then he climbed into the sleigh and drove off, leaving her in the spray of kicked-up snow, the sleigh bells fading into the brittle silence. For a long moment she didn't move. The cold pressed against her spine, numbing, unforgiving. Shame curled through her like smoke from a dying fire. She had traveled days by rail, spent every saved coin, and pinned fragile hopes on a stranger who walked away without hesitation. Her knees weakened, and she caught herself against the station post, breath spilling in uneven bursts. Somewhere behind her, Mrs. Alder called her name, hurrying forward with a blanket, but Evelyn barely heard the words. The world felt distant, muffled by falling snow and the hollow ache spreading in her chest. She closed her eyes, willing herself not to cry. Tears would freeze too quickly anyway. Then the wind shifted. A presence stirred the air, large enough for her to sense before she looked. When she opened her eyes, she saw him, a tall figure emerging through the drifting snow with the steady grace of someone shaped by wilderness rather than comfort. He wore a winter-worn blanket shawl draped across his bare chest, dark skin warmed by the hue of embers rather than frost. Broad shoulders, powerful arms, hair braided with small beads that caught the faint lantern light. His footsteps made no sound. He stopped a few paces away, watching her with an expression that was not pity, not curiosity, simply awareness, as though he could feel the cold in her bones and the quiet storm in her heart. "You're freezing," he said, his voice low and calm, like a drum slowed by winter. "You shouldn't be alone out here." The wind tugged at her coat again, almost lifting the hem. She swallowed hard, unsure if words would obey her. He stepped forward slowly, showing no threat, only intention. When his hand reached for her suitcase, she noticed the way he moved, deliberate, gentle, every gesture shaped by respect. He lifted the suitcase with one effortless motion, holding it as though its weight meant nothing to him. Mrs. Alder hurried to explain who he was, voice flustered. "Tawa Blackthorn," she said, "from the settlement across the ridge. Helps around the town when storms come through. Good man, strong hands, quiet soul." Tawa didn't acknowledge the introduction. His gaze remained steady on Evelyn, waiting for her permission to guide her toward shelter. She hesitated only because she had grown so used to holding her own burdens. But the cold was relentless, and something about his presence, the unspoken patience, the certainty, loosened the tightness in her chest. He nodded toward the station door. "Warmth waits inside." Evelyn stepped forward, and he matched her pace, not leading, not pushing, simply walking beside her as though her steps set the rhythm. But just before they reached the doorway he paused. Snow swirled between them like small, wandering spirits. His eyes held a spark she couldn't decipher, something ancient and deeply human. "Tonight," he said softly, "you're the Christmas party's chief guest." The words fell over her like a kind of miracle she didn't yet understand. She froze not from cold but from disbelief. Behind them, the wind hushed, and even the storm seemed to lean closer, waiting. In that suspended breath of winter, Evelyn felt something shift. Not hope returning exactly, but the faint outline of a new story forming, one she had never dared imagine. And as Tawa stepped back to let her enter the warm light of the station house, she realized she wasn't trembling anymore, though the world outside remained bitter cold. Because his final words, spoken with quiet certainty, echoed within her like a promise she didn't know she was allowed to receive. Warmth met Evelyn the moment she crossed the threshold of the station house, a wave of stove-borne heat washing over her chilled skin and loosening the stiffness in her fingers. The small room glowed with amber light from an iron lamp, perched on a counter scarred by decades of travelers' hurried signatures. Mrs. Alder ushered her inside with the tenderness of someone who mothered even strangers, wrapping a thick quilt around her shoulders and pressing her gently toward the stove. Evelyn didn't resist. Her body had grown so cold it felt nearly separate from her, a vessel she was learning to inhabit again in hesitant breaths. Tawa remained just outside the doorway, as if reluctant to intrude upon the closeness of the space. Snow clung to his hair, sparkled faintly against his shoulders, but he did not brush it away. He stood with the steady stillness of a mountain in early winter, letting the storm settle around him. Only when Mrs. Alder called softly did he step inside, closing the door without a sound. Evelyn watched him with quiet curiosity. The room felt smaller with him in it, not because of his size but because of the calm gravity he carried, the kind that made noise hush and lantern flames steady. He placed her suitcase gently near the wall, as though setting down something fragile. She noticed his hands, strong enough to lift a fallen pine trunk, she imagined, yet careful in a way that suggested he understood how easily some things break. The contrast unsettled her, tugging at a depth inside her she wasn't prepared to examine. Mrs. Alder bustled about, heating tea, slicing a loaf of molasses bread, instructing her children not to hover. But Jonah and Lily peeked around corners anyway, their small eyes tracking Tawa as if he were a figure from one of their father's campfire tales. It made Evelyn smile despite herself. To them he was a hero. To her he was something more mysterious, an unexpected shelter in a moment when the world had felt utterly cruel. The tea warmed her hands, then her throat, and slowly her thoughts began to arrange themselves again. With warmth returning, humiliation rose, sharp and metallic beneath her ribs. She lowered the cup, staring into the dark liquid as though answers might float there. Caleb's rejection had cut deeper than she allowed herself to show. She hadn't come seeking romance, only a place to belong, a quiet corner of the world to rebuild the pieces of a life that had splintered long before she boarded the train. Being unwanted wasn't new, but being dismissed so easily, so publicly, stirred an ache she didn't know how to hide. Tawa seemed to sense the shift in her posture. His voice entered the room like a low wind slipping between cedar branches. "The cold almost took you. You were standing too long outside." He didn't ask what had happened. He didn't need to. The truth had hung in the air like a shadow cast by the lantern. Evelyn lifted her gaze, meeting his dark eyes, steady as river stone. For the first time she noticed a small scar near his temple, almost hidden by a strand of his braided hair. It softened him somehow, made him human in a way his strength didn't. She looked away quickly, unsure why her breath had tightened at the sight. Jonah approached him timidly, holding a broken wooden sled runner. "Mr. Blackthorne," he whispered, "Mama said you could fix anything." Tawa knelt, accepting the small offering with a nod that seemed too solemn for a child's toy. He examined it with the same care he had given her suitcase. Lily leaned over his shoulder, her braids brushing his arm, trusting him without hesitation. Evelyn found herself watching more closely than she intended. There was a gentleness in him that existed not in words, but in the quiet acts that stitched their way through a life. She felt herself leaning toward that warmth, drawn as though her heart recognized something her mind had not yet named. Mrs. Alder spoke brightly as she cleaned dishes. "The Christmas gathering will be lively tonight. Music, pie, dancing if the snow eases." She looked pointedly at Evelyn with a hopeful smile. A cheerful evening might be just the thing. Evelyn offered a thin smile but didn't respond. The idea of facing the town, of stepping into a hall where whispers would bloom like frost flowers at her heels, filled her with dread. She could already imagine Caleb's smirk, the way he would boast about being wise to refuse her. A woman alone in winter was an easy subject of cruel curiosity. But Tawa broke the tension with a single quiet sentence, spoken without force yet carrying the weight of certainty. "She'll come with me. She is the guest of honor." Mrs. Alder blinked, startled, then grinned as though the matter had been settled. Evelyn's breath hitched. Guest of honor. The word struck her as too generous, too large for her shoulders. She almost protested, but Tawa was already standing, handing the repaired sled runner back to Jonah, who cheered and rushed outside to test it. Lily followed, giggling, leaving the door ajar long enough for a gust of wind to sweep fresh snow across the floorboards. Tawa stepped near the stove, arms crossed loosely over his chest, as if absorbing the heat without needing it. Evelyn felt his presence like an invisible cloak around her, protective, steady, rooted. She wanted to understand why he had spoken for her so easily. Why he had taken it upon himself to ensure she would not face the night alone. Perhaps in his culture, offering shelter was simply what one did. Or perhaps he had seen something in her eyes she had not meant to reveal, an exhausted woman standing at the edge of something hollow. She found her voice gently. "You don't need to trouble yourself with me." His answer came without hesitation. "Winter takes too much already. We must not let it take what it shouldn't." His words were simple, yet they loosened something tightly woven inside her. She felt the sting of tears she refused to shed. Gratitude, raw and unexpected, rose like a tide. She bowed her head, letting the shadows hide her expression. The room grew quiet. Even the stove seemed to soften its crackling, as though listening. Outside, dusk thickened, turning the windows into squares of deep blue. Lanterns flickered along the street, glowing like small promises against the storm. Townsfolk passed with bundles and sleds, heading toward the church hall where music would soon rise. Evelyn might have felt left behind if not for the awareness of Tawa's steady silhouette in her periphery. Mrs. Alder brought her a wool shawl, its fibers warm and freshly brushed. "Wear this tonight, dear. The color suits you." Evelyn accepted it, fingers brushing the soft weave. Something inside her shifted, an ember catching after being cold too long. She rose slowly, testing her balance. Tawa moved toward the door, opening it to the snowy twilight. He didn't look back as he stood there, but she felt him waiting, felt that he would walk beside her at whatever pace she chose. That unspoken patience sent another wave of warmth through her. She stepped closer, the shawl wrapped snug around her shoulders. A gust of icy air swept inside, swirling around her skirts. The sky overhead brimmed with layered clouds, faint stars trembling at the edges. She hesitated on the threshold. The world outside felt vast, uncertain, filled with eyes that might judge her harshly. But when Tawa extended his hand, not touching her, merely offering the direction of his palm, she felt a new steadiness rise. She stepped into the snow. Their footsteps fell in quiet rhythm, the only sound the crunch of powder beneath their boots. For a moment, she allowed herself to breathe deeply, filling her lungs with air so crisp it almost tasted like hope. Lights shimmered in the distance like scattered gold. But as they neared the heart of town, she saw a familiar figure standing near the hitching posts. Caleb Dunn. His expression sharp, his pride wounded. His eyes locked on her, then flicked to Tawa with something darker than simple resentment brewing beneath the surface. Evelyn slowed. Tawa felt the change instantly. His shoulders squared subtly, his pace adjusting without comment. Caleb pushed away from the post and stepped forward. And the snow between them thickened, as if winter itself sensed the storm about to break. Snow swirled around Caleb Dunn as he stepped toward them, his boots grinding through the frost with a rude insistence that made Evelyn's breath shorten. Lantern light from the church hall spilled across his face, revealing the tightness in his jaw, the prickling sting of wounded pride etched into the corners of his eyes. He looked her over with a bitterness that made her feel small again, though she fought the instinct to shrink beneath his gaze. The humiliation he had dealt her at the station still trembled inside her, like a bruise touched too soon. Caleb's voice came rough, low, soaked in the sharp tang of whiskey and winter air. "Didn't expect you to parade around town so soon after I let you off easy. Could have waited a day before showing off a new protector." His stare slid toward Tawa, cold and cutting, as though he expected the giant Apache to back away. But Tawa stood beside her without moving, without hardening, without rising to the bait. His calm was the kind that settled storms rather than caused them. Evelyn sensed it even before he spoke. The wind rasped between the buildings, tugging at their coats, spinning snowflakes across the lantern glow. Tawa's voice was soft but steady. She needed warmth. Safety. "You left her in the cold." Caleb scoffed, kicking at the snow. "She wasn't my responsibility. I made a choice. Ain't a crime to change my mind." Evelyn swallowed the ache tightening her throat. His carelessness felt heavier in his voice than in his actions, and she realized for the first time that his rejection hadn't been personal. It had been effortless, thoughtless, as if she were nothing more than a misplaced parcel. Before she could muster words, the church doors swung open, and a wave of fiddle music drifted out, warm and lively. Townsfolk spilled into the glow, their chatter mingling with the winter air. Reverend Pike greeted her with a kind nod, his eyes soft with concern as he took in the tension. "Evening, Miss Hart. Welcome." His gaze shifted to Tawa with a familiar, respectful warmth. "Glad to see you here, son." Caleb bristled at the attention given to the two of them as a pair. He leaned closer to Evelyn, voice lowered but sharp. "People talk, you know. They'll say you came here trying to snare anyone who'd take you. That you walked off the train desperate." Evelyn felt her cheeks burn, not with shame but with anger, slow, deep, rising like heat through frozen soil. Caleb's words tried to twist her story into something cheap. But before she could reply, Tawa stepped between them, not with force but with presence. His broad frame blocked the bite of Caleb's words, as though forming a shelter around her. "Enough." His tone carried a warning, not shouted, not violent, simply certain. It was the quiet certainty that unsettled Caleb more than any threat. Caleb threw up his hands. "Fine. Fine. Keep her. She's your problem now." Then he stormed off into the crowd, muttering curses swallowed by snow and music. Evelyn let out a trembling breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. The tension left her body all at once, leaving her unsteady. Tawa's arm didn't reach for her, but he angled himself subtly so she could lean on the air near him if she needed to. "You do not need to fear him," Tawa murmured, his gaze following the disappearing figure. "He is loud because he is small inside." The words struck her unexpectedly. They weren't cruel, they were true, spoken with a clarity that softened their edge. Evelyn looked around at the people entering the church hall. Some stared at her with curiosity, others with sympathy, a few with kindness. Nadine Gray approached with a welcoming smile, brushing stray flakes from her shawl. "You poor thing. Pay him no mind. Men like that don't know treasure even when it shivers in front of them." Evelyn blushed at the compliment, unsure how to accept it. Nadine squeezed her hand before drifting back to her husband, leaving a trail of peppermint warmth behind her. Inside the hall, wreaths hung from the beams, candles flickered along the walls, and the scent of pine and cinnamon filled the air. A tall fir stood in the center, branches gleaming with ribbons and tiny hand-carved ornaments. Children gathered around Tawa the moment he stepped inside, tugging at his hands and coat, begging him to lift the star to the top of the tree. He smiled with quiet humor, nodding once before allowing himself to be guided to the fir. Evelyn watched from the entryway as he lifted a little girl with ease, holding her steady while she placed the wooden star atop the highest branch. The room erupted into applause, and the girl beamed down at him with bright-eyed admiration. The sight stirred something warm inside Evelyn. She took a step forward, then another, letting herself be drawn into the glow of the lanterns and laughter. Someone handed her a cup of hot cider, sweet and steaming. She wrapped both hands around it, grounding herself in the simple comfort. Music lifted again, filling the hall with rhythm. Couples moved across the floor, boots tapping softly, dresses swaying like drifting snow. Evelyn stood along the edge, unsure whether she belonged among the joy and movement. She had imagined a quiet arrival in town, not this sudden thrust into light and attention. Yet she felt the faint tug of belonging, the early stirrings of roots testing unfamiliar soil. Tawa approached her after setting the children down, his steps slow, unhurried. He stood beside her, not touching, not crowding, just sharing space in a way that steadied her heartbeat. "You are safe here," he said gently. "If you wish to leave, we will go. If you wish to stay, we stay." She lifted her gaze to him, surprised by the softness she found there. His presence felt like a hearth, warm without burning, bright without blinding. "I don't know what I wish yet," she admitted, her voice barely more than a breath. He nodded, accepting her uncertainty as easily as he accepted the children's tugging hands. Uncertainty is not weakness. It is the first step of choosing your own path. His words settled into her like snow landing on warm earth, melting just enough to seep inward. Beneath the music and laughter, beneath the swirl of bodies and soft candle haze, she felt something shift. Not love, nothing so sudden, but the awareness of a man who spoke gently in a world that rarely offered gentleness. A man who had stepped into the cold for her without knowing her. A man who stood between her and cruelty without raising his voice. The fiddle quickened, and the dancers spun in wide arcs. A gust of wind rattled the shutters. Outside, snow deepened, blanketing the world in silence and silver. Evelyn began to lift her cup for another sip when she noticed a shape through the frosted window. A lone figure stood at the edge of the churchyard, half hidden by drifting snow. Watching. Still. Unmoving. Her heart skipped, the warmth in her chest faltering. Tawa followed her gaze, his expression tightening just slightly. Caleb had returned. And this time, he wasn't alone. Snow drifted in heavy curtains outside the church hall windows, each flake catching the lantern glow like drifting sparks from an unseen fire. Evelyn felt the warmth of the room dim as she watched Caleb standing in the yard, the outline of another man just behind him, a vague shape swallowed by stormlight. She tightened her grip on her cup. Something cold spread beneath her ribs, a warning she did not yet understand but instinctively feared. Tawa moved a half-step closer, silent, steady, as though grounding her with the quiet weight of his presence. His calm didn't erase her fear, but it gave it shape, something she could hold rather than be held by. The music faded as people noticed the tension threading through the room. Conversations softened into cautious murmurs. A few women whispered behind mittened hands. A cluster of children paused mid-game, eyes drifting toward the window with curiosity and unease. Reverend Pike stepped forward, his brow creasing with concern. He followed Evelyn's gaze, then exhaled slowly, the sound heavy with unspoken worry. Caleb pushed open the door with a clatter, bringing a gust of frigid air into the hall. His cheeks were flushed from anger or drink, perhaps both. The tall man behind him stepped into view, broad-shouldered, wearing a dark coat dusted with snow, unfamiliar to most of the townsfolk. Caleb jabbed a thumb in Evelyn's direction. "There she is. Told you she ain't what she claimed. Told you she came here stirring trouble." Evelyn felt heat rush into her face. Her throat tightened, but she kept still, standing where she was, her spine a fragile column she willed not to bend. Tawa's gaze held steady on Caleb, unreadable, not rising to meet the provocation. It was the stranger who stepped forward first, looking Evelyn over with cold, assessing eyes. This the mail-order bride you wrote me about? The one causing you grief? She didn't know this man, had never seen him, yet the way he looked at her, like a problem to be evaluated, not a person, made her want to disappear into the folds of her shawl. Caleb nodded sharply. Told him he ought to see for himself. Didn't want folks thinking I'd rejected a saint. Didn't expect her to run straight to. He waved a hand dismissively at Tawa, as though the word he wanted to use would stir too much trouble spoken aloud. The room froze. The unspoken prejudice hung in the air like smoke. Tawa didn't move. His stillness felt almost sacred, the calm before a storm that had chosen not to break. Evelyn felt the weight of his restraint, the honor in it, and something inside her ached with gratitude. She stepped forward, voice quiet but unwavering. You left me at the station, Caleb. In the cold. Without thought, without care. If there is trouble here tonight, it did not begin with me. Caleb's face twisted. Woman, don't pretend you weren't just trying to find any man to take you in. Before Evelyn could speak, Nadine Gray rushed to her side. That's enough, Caleb Dunn. You've embarrassed yourself enough tonight. Caleb ignored her, his pride feeding the flames of his resentment. The stranger beside him folded his arms. Doesn't seem worth the fuss. Looks harmless. Sad maybe. But harmless. Evelyn's breath faltered. Sad. The word struck deeper than she liked. She straightened, meeting the man's eyes with a quiet strength she hadn't felt earlier that evening. I am not sad. I am cold. And tired. And tired of being spoken over. A ripple of surprise passed through the crowd. Even Caleb blinked, taken aback by her firmness. But his anger resurfaced quickly, fueled by humiliation. You wouldn't even be here if I hadn't sent for you. You'd still be drifting, looking for a home you don't deserve. Something in Tawa shifted. Not visibly, not violently, but profoundly. He stepped between Evelyn and Caleb with a grace that felt carved from centuries of patience. His voice was soft, yet it carried through the hall like the first deep note of thunder. A home is not given by those who fear kindness. A home is built by those who understand it. Caleb's breath hitched, his insecurity laid bare. For a moment, he looked almost young, lost, ashamed. But he shook it off, leaning heavily into anger again. Fine. Keep your stray. Makes no difference to me. Evelyn flinched at the word stray, though she hid it as best she could. Tawa, however, heard the quiet catch of her breath. He turned just enough that she knew he stood with her, not in front of her. Not shielding. Standing with. It made strength bloom beneath her ribs, shaky but real. Reverend Pike stepped forward, voice firm. This is a Christmas gathering, not a battleground. Caleb, you've said your piece. Leave these good people in peace, and let this night be what it should be. Caleb muttered under his breath, but retreated toward the door, the stranger following him into the thick snow. The door shut behind them with a hollow thud. The hall slowly exhaled, voices rising again in cautious ripples. Someone restarted the fiddle, though it played softer now, as though wary of breaking the fragile calm. Evelyn felt the energy drain from her limbs, replaced by a trembling she tried to hide. The confrontation had scraped open old wounds she didn't realize still bled. She stepped toward the back of the hall, seeking a pocket of quiet amid the noise. Tawa followed, not touching her, not speaking, simply matching her steps like a shadow shaped by compassion. She reached the small side door and slipped outside into the cold night. The snowfall was gentler now, the flakes drifting lazily, as though tired from their earlier fury. She inhaled deeply, the air crisp and sharp in her lungs. The muffled sound of music seeped through the walls, softened by distance and snow. Tawa stepped out, letting the door close behind him. The lantern by the doorway flickered, casting a warm halo around them. Evelyn wrapped her shawl tighter, suddenly aware of the enormity of the night, of the choices that had brought her here, of the future that stretched before her in uncertain, unbroken whiteness. She spoke without looking at him. I didn't expect such anger. I thought rejection was humiliation enough. I didn't think it would follow me here. Tawa studied her in the lantern glow, his expression softened by empathy. Some men mistake cruelty for strength. They believe they lose power when truth is spoken to them. He paused, then added gently, Your truth tonight was strong. Her breath wavered, a mix of gratitude and weariness. I wasn't strong. I was scared. And alone. You were not alone, Tawa said quietly. And you are not alone now. The words nearly broke her. Not because they were grand, but because they were simple. Honest. Without expectation. She felt tears prick her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She had cried too often in places where no one cared to see. A silence unfolded between them, soft and profound. Snow gathered at their feet. The lantern hummed faintly above. Evelyn felt warmth bloom inside her despite the cold, drawn from the way he stood with her. Patient, open, unassuming. She turned toward him slowly. Tawa, why did you help me? His breath visibly deepened, as though he had been waiting for the question. He looked away for a moment, toward the falling snow, gathering his thoughts with quiet reverence. Because, he murmured, when I saw you standing at the station, I saw someone trying not to fall. And I could not let winter claim a soul who still fights to stand. Her heart trembled. She didn't know how to respond, how to hold the weight of such gentleness. Before she could speak, he stepped closer, not touching her but closer, his voice lowering into something that felt like the edge of confession. And there is something else. Her breath stilled. In the snowy quiet, he lifted his gaze back to hers, eyes dark and full of something unspoken, something that made the night itself seem to lean closer. You should know why I watched you long before you ever saw me. The world held its breath. Snow drifted like quiet blessings around them as Tawa's breath steadied, gathering the courage of a man who had carried his truth too long in silence. Evelyn felt her pulse echo the hush of the night, each beat trembling with expectation. The lantern's thin halo framed his face, softening the strength there, revealing something vulnerable beneath the stoic calm he wore like winter armor. When he finally spoke, his voice moved through the cold air like a slow, warming ember. I saw you when you stepped off the train. Not when Caleb arrived. Long before. You stood there holding your suitcase as though it contained the last of your hope. And you looked, not lost, but brave about losing. Evelyn's breath broke in a small, startled exhale. She had believed herself invisible in that moment, a ghost of a future that had collapsed too quickly to mourn. Knowing he had seen her, truly seen her, made the memory shift, soften, glow faintly instead of sting. She whispered, barely trusting her voice, Why didn't you come then? Tawa's gaze dropped to the snow between them, where flakes gathered like scattered truths. Because gentleness must never be rushed. A soul standing in sorrow deserves space to breathe, not a stranger's shadow stepping too close. I waited until you were ready to lift your head again. When you did, he looked back at her, eyes deep as river stone warmed by firelight. I could not look away. Her heart opened like a slow-blooming ember inside her chest. In all her years no one had spoken to her like this, not with heat, not with hunger, but with reverence. She stepped closer without thinking, drawn by the quiet certainty in his voice. The cold wind tugged at her shawl, but she barely felt it. Tawa, she murmured, and his name felt like a prayer carried on breath. He reached out, stopping just short of touching her cheek. His hand hovered in the air, asking without speaking. She leaned into the space between them, granting permission. His fingers brushed her skin, warm despite the winter, sending a gentle shock through her, as though the world had tilted subtly toward hope. You are strong, Evelyn Hart, he said softly. Not because you endure, but because you still hope after enduring. That is a rare kind of courage. He let his hand fall slowly, but the warmth remained, as if pressed into her memory. The church bells rang in the distance, calling the town to midnight prayer. Their echoes rippled across the snowy fields, weaving through the hush around them. Evelyn turned toward the sound, then back to him, her eyes shining with questions she hadn't yet named. What happens now? She whispered. Tawa inhaled deeply, the breath lifting his broad shoulders like a man carrying both fear and certainty in equal measure. Now. I speak the truth I have carried from the moment I saw you. He took her hands in his, large, warm, steady, closing around them with the gentleness of someone holding fragile light. I did not bring you to the Christmas gathering so you would not feel alone. I brought you because the moment you stepped from that train, something in me, something long sleeping, woke like a fire catching in winter branches. Evelyn trembled, not from cold, but from the overwhelming tenderness threading through his voice. He stepped closer, their breath mingling in the lantern glow. I cannot offer you promises carved in haste. But I can offer this: my respect, my steadiness, my heart that has not spoken your name aloud until now. Evelyn, I love you. The world stilled. Snow hung in the air like suspended stars. Her heart surged with a fierce, quiet certainty she hadn't known she possessed. She lifted his hands to her chest, letting him feel the truth of her answering heartbeat. And from somewhere deep within her, warmth unfurled like dawn breaking over cold mountains. The door behind them creaked open. A shadow stepped out, breath harsh, boots crunching through the snow. Caleb had returned. And he'd heard every word.